Hey guys, so today I'm here with the Mammoth 3-inch front, 2-inch rear lift kit fitting all 2007 to 2018 JK Wranglers. So a leveling kit or a spacer lift kit is a perfect way to gain a little bit of extra height on your Wrangler at a very affordable price point, and it's also going to be very easy to do. So this is going to do a great job at opening up a lot of room in the wheel well for larger wheels and tires, perfect for somebody who's looking to upgrade and do that. And this is also going to do a really good job at leveling out the factory rake in your hood, creating a more aggressive stance with your Jeep overall. Now this is going to come with that 3-inch spacer in the front as well as the 2-inch spacer in the rear, and it's also going to come with a rear shock extension as well. Perfect for somebody who's looking for a starter kit to build off of, and also perfect for somebody who doesn't want to get too involved in their suspension. They're only looking for a really easy and practical way to get a little bit of extra height on their Wrangler. Now as far as tire sizes go, this is going to comfortably fit up to a 35-inch tire, leaving you some decent room in the wheel well for up travel and better articulation off-road. Now a 33-inch tire is still going to fit very nicely inside the wheel well, giving you a little bit more room for up travel and articulation than a 35 will. So as for 37-inch tires, they are not going to fit with this lift kit. You may get some rubbing from wheel lock to wheel lock, and you also are probably going to have some tire defender contact if you do hit a bump with 37s mounted up with this lift kit. So as far as tire sizes go, I would recommend a 33 or a 35. However, this is going to fit up to a 35-inch tire. Now, like I mentioned before, this is going to be very affordable at roughly $160, making this one of your most affordable options for a spacer lift kit or even just a lift kit in general on our site. Now, this is just going to come with the 2 spacers as well as the rear shock extensions. So because this is a pretty bare bones lift kit, that's really going to explain that price point. So when you're taking a look at lift kits all across the board, you'll usually notice that those more expensive choices are usually just going to come with a couple of extra components in comparison to this one. However, but in my personal opinion, if you're looking for a very easy and very affordable way to get a little bit of extra height on your Wrangler, then this is going to be a perfect solution for you. So install is going to be a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. You're going to need some pretty basic hand tools to get the job done. So speaking of the install, let's jump into that now. The tools that I used for this install were an impact wrench, electric and pneumatic, a dead blow, 21mm, 19mm, 18mm, and 10mm deep socket, an 18mm and 16mm swivel socket, a 15mm socket, a 10mm deep socket, 1/4-inch drive ratchet, 18mm open-ended or box wrench, a trim removal tool, blue thread locker, a 5-inch and a 15-inch extension. So the first step to this is to get your Jeep up in the air, whether it be on a jack and jack stand or on a lift like we have here. And then next we're going to go ahead and take off the wheels. Now I already did that, and we are going to be starting in the front. So if you are on a jack and jack stands, you're going to want to take off the front wheels and chock the rear wheels. So next you're going to want to support the axle. I have 2 pole jacks here, and then we can go ahead and take off our sway bar end links, just the bottom bolt. So I'm going to be using an 18mm swivel socket and an 18mm wrench to do that. So our next step is to remove the track bar axle side bolt. This is going to allow our axle to drop, so I'm going to use a 21mm socket and a 5-inch extension to clear the drag link here. So our next step is to remove the lower shock bolt. I'm going to use an 18mm swivel and an 18mm wrench to remove that bolt. So while we're over on this side of the frame, what I'm going to do is remove the brake line bracket that's connected to our frame using a 10mm socket. So what we can do next is lower down our axle so we can take out our springs. What we can do now is take out our springs. So what we can do now is remove our factory isolator so we can reinstall it on our spacer. So in order to drop our axle low enough in order to get the spacer and our factory spring in, I do want to disconnect this bracket on the bottom of our spring perch that has our brake lines attached. I don't want to max out our brake lines here. So I'm going to take a 10mm socket and my 1/4" drive ratchet, and I'm going to remove this bolt on the side of the spring perch so we can wiggle out this brake line bracket. So you're going to want to do this on both sides, and that'll give us a little bit of extra length on our brake lines. You wiggle it out forward, you can slide out that pin in the back, and that's just going to give us some extra wiggle room. You're going to want to do that on the other side as well, and then we can disconnect our drive shaft. So the other thing that we want to do is disconnect our drive shaft. Now this is limiting how far we can lower our axle because it's hitting on the exhaust. So what we need to do is mark both of the flanges. I've already done that to make sure that we line it up and bolt it back up in the correct orientation. Then we can take a 15mm socket and an extension and remove the 4 bolts. Once all of the bolts are removed, we can wiggle it off the flange and set it aside so we can lower our axle. So after we've lowered our axle a little bit farther down, what we can do is take our provided 3-inch spacer as well as our factory isolator and reinstall those on the jounce tube. So it should stay in place for the most part, and then we can grab our factory spring and put that back into place. So our next step is just to install our factory spring and make sure that the pigtail is sitting correctly at the bottom of the spring perch. Then we can do the same thing for the other side and then raise up our axle. Then we can just repeat that process on the other side. So after both of the springs are in, what we can do is start to raise up the axle, and we're going to try to reconnect everything. So essentially what we have to do after we put our spacers as well as our factory springs back in is get our shocks in, and then we can bolt everything up in reverse order. However, because this is a 3-inch spacer, our shocks don't want to go in with the Jeep up on the lift because it is pushing off the lift points. So what I'm going to do is put the wheels and tires back on, put it down on its own weight, and bolt up the shocks so then the axle is limited to its drop, and then we can bolt everything back up there. So I'm going to grab these stock tires, bolt those up, and then we can put this thing on the ground and get those bolted up. So once the Jeep's down on its own weight, you want to make sure that the brake line bracket on the spring perch is in place. So we're going to wiggle that back in place. We don't have to bolt it right up right now. Then we can put in our shock bolt. We can thread our nut on the back. All right, so now we can put the Jeep back up in the air and secure everything down. So now we have our shocks reconnected. What we can do is tighten down our lower shock bolt using an 18mm swivel and an 18mm wrench. Then while we're here, what we can do is reconnect our brake line brackets, one at the bottom of the spring perch and then the other at the frame. So what we can do now is reinstall our drive shaft, making sure that it's oriented in the correct way. So when doing this, you want to make sure that you reapply blue Loctite or blue thread locker onto each of the 4 bolts. Then once those are on, we can tighten them back up with that 15mm socket and the 5-inch extension. Last but not least, we can bolt up our sway bar end links using the factory hardware and tightening that down with an 18mm socket and wrench. So the last thing that we need to do after the sway bar end links is reconnect our front track bar. However, we do have to do that on the ground with the weight of the Jeep on there, and then we will be able to line that up and bolt it down. But for now, we can head to the rear. So now that we've moved to the back, we want to do the same thing that we did with the front and support our rear axle, and then we can go ahead and take out the lower shock bolt using an 18mm socket and wrench. Might have to put a little bit of weight on the axle and the bolt should pop free. Then we can remove the upper bolts on the shocks bar pin using a 16mm swivel, and I'm also using a 15-inch extension. So after the shock's disconnected, what we can do is just wiggle it out of the mount, and we can put that aside. So our next step is to remove our lower bolt out of our sway bar end link. So I'm going to use an 18mm socket and wrench. We can do the same thing on the other side. So again, just like the front, we do need to disconnect the axle side of our track bar in order to get our axle to drop. So I'm going to use a 21mm socket to remove that bolt. So then we can take off our brake line bracket using a 10mm socket. And also unhook our ABS line. There are a couple of clips holding it in, so I'm going to use a trim removal tool and take off just a couple of clips that are in the frame just so we can have a little bit of slack. We can do the same thing for the other side. So we also need to remove this bracket that's holding up our e-brake. So there are two 10mm nuts that we have to remove, and then we have to unhook this bracket. So I'm going to use a 10mm deep socket to remove both of those nuts. After those are removed, we can unhook this bracket from our e-brake. And we can discard that and move to our springs. So before we go ahead and lower the axle, I am going to take this breather tube off the axle just so we don't rip it off the axle. And then we can go ahead and start to lower it down. So what we can do is take out our springs at this point with our factory isolator. So our next step is to install our spacer on our spring perch. So what we have to do is take our provided nut plate and put that on top. Center that in the middle. And then we can take our provided spacer as well as our provided hardware, which is going to be that bolt and a lock washer. So I'm going to use an 18mm socket and a 5-inch extension in order to thread that into the nut plate. So once that's threaded into place, we can tighten that down with that same 18mm socket and 5-inch extension. And we can do the same thing on the other side and then install our isolator and spring. So we can reinstall our spring with our factory isolator on top. Raise our axle just so it stays in place while we get our other spring in. And what we can do is just raise up the axle, make sure the springs are sitting correctly in the isolator. What we can do at this point is start buttoning everything else up, starting with our sway bar end links. So we're going to reconnect that bottom bolt. May have to raise up on the axle or pull your sway bar down. You can tighten that up with an 18mm socket and wrench. Same thing for the other side. Then we can button up our brake lines. So we're just going to reinstall our brake lines with that factory bolt and tightening it up with a 10mm socket. So our next step is to install our shocks and our shock extension. So how I like to do this is take our shock extension and thread one of our bolts into our factory location, leaving a little bit of space on the bolt. Then we can grab our shock and hook one of the bar pins onto the bolt. Take the other bolt and then thread that into place. So now we can go ahead and tighten those down using that same 16mm swivel socket and that 15-inch extension. So what we can do is secure the bottom of our shock with our factory bolt. You may have to tinker with the height of the axle in order to get that through. Then we can tighten that down with an 18mm socket and wrench. So the last thing that we have to do before this lift kit is finished is to put on our wheels and tires so we can reconnect our front and our rear track bar. So in order to get your track bar to line up with your axle, you should have somebody in the driver's seat turning the steering wheel left and right, and that will move the track bar and the axle enough to line it up. Then you want to reinstall that factory bolt and the flag nut on the back, and then we can tighten down that bolt with a 21mm socket and an extension using the impact wrench. And then we can do the same for the rear. So in the back, it's going to be the same thing. We are going to be reinstalling the factory bolt. However, to get this one to line up, you will need someone to wiggle the back end of the Wrangler, and then once you have the flag nut and the bolt through and attached, what we can do is tighten that down with a 21mm socket. So that's going to wrap it up for my review and install. Make sure you like and subscribe, and for more videos and products like this, always keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.